Woo, all my fans are here. I always wanted to preach to an overflowed church. Man, that's great. Happy Mother's Day. When I was asked to give the message today, I had given a message 3 years ago about my mother. And this time they asked me to talk about my father. And I said, well, it's not even Father's Day. And they said, well, and I thought, my mom and dad were so entwined with each other that you can't talk about one without talking about the other. So here I go. First of all, I'd like to give a physical description of my father. He was 6'4". He weighed between 200 and 250 pounds all the years that I knew him. He had real bushy eyebrows. He had hazel eyes. He had a huge mouth. And he smiled all the time. And his hands were so huge. They were just huge. And he played, well, it was good because he played baseball till he was 40 years old when he had to hang up his cleats. And he was a first baseman, and he was a pitcher. And let's just say people learned not to crowd the plate when he was pitching because he pitched right at them. And he was a man of good character. He said what he meant and meant what he said, and he only said it once. And I'll tell you one little thing about after I married Bob. Bob decided that he wanted to help my dad cut wood. And my dad said, fine, you come right down. And so before lunch, they were out chopping wood and everything like that. My dad said, I want them cut so many inches. Bob said, fine. Bob didn't think that was the right amount of inches. So he changed it. My dad never said a word, never said anything. And we went in for lunch, and when they went back out, Bob came back in, and I said, what's wrong? And he said, there aren't any tools out there. He said your dad put them all away. And I said, oh, okay. So when I got home, I called Dad, and I said, I see you put the tools away. He said, I think you got the point. So that was my father. He loved women. He loved girls. He liked all of my friends. He loved all my sister's friends. He was just one of these people that really respected women. Not just liked it, he respected them. He thought they were absolutely wonderful. And whenever we'd go to church, Carol and I'd get ready, and he'd come out, and he'd say, oh, you're just beautiful. And I'd think, oh, I am. Hairy legs and all, I was gorgeous. And, the thing is, though, I just want to tell you, his faith journey was so different from my mother's. My mother was a very, very, very strong person, and she was so faithful, and so dedicated, and she had her meditation time, like I told you before, and she was very spiritual and very religious. And my dad, he liked to have a drink. He liked to play cards. He liked to dance, loved to dance. And the Free Methodists frowned on that. As a matter of fact, we were never allowed to have a drink in the house. So my dad tied his beer, put a rope around it, put it down in the place where the cattle drank, because it was real cold water and everything like that. And my mom didn't care, and she didn't like any heavy drinking or anything like that. And she didn't think playing cards, now it was okay to play Old Maid, but it wasn't okay to play poker if you gambled. It was the gambling part of it. So the Free Methodists had these things that you just didn't do. So I think his journey was unbelievable, really unbelievable. He never went to church the entire time I was growing up. He went to funerals and he went to weddings. He looked great. He wouldn't even come to a program at the church if I was in it, if I was singing. And he'd say, after I came back, he said, well, how was it? And I'd say, it was great. He said, well, then sing it to me. So I'd sing it to him. He said, does it sound better when you're just singing it to me? And I said, whatever. But he would take us to church twice on Sunday, Wednesday night, prayer meeting. I was there all the time. And so he'd ask me, he'd say, on the way home, he'd say, how was the sermon? I'd say it was loud and long. And he said, ooh. And I said, it's long, Dad. I said, an hour preaching is long. And I said, they repeat and they repeat and they repeat like I can't get it the first time. And I said, I don't like that. And he said, well, he said, you got to go with it. That's what your mother wants. I said, okay. However, he did go up to the American Legion Hall a lot and dance with Mrs. Gibson. Because her husband didn't like to dance, he liked to dance, and so Carol and I used to slip out of the house and go up and look in the window at the American Legion. And he could dance. He could really dance. One night I woke up and it was about, midnight, and I heard the radio playing, and I heard them giggling. So I went over to Carol's room. I said, Carol. I said, listen. I said, the radio's playing, and I said, they're giggling. And she said, I said, come on, let's go down and look. So we slipped downstairs and we peeked around the corner. My mother's doing the Charleston. And I'm saying, how about that? So then a slow song came on, and he took her in his arms, and they danced all over the living room and the dining room, and they started to come to where we were. And boy, Carol and I, we slipped back upstairs, and I said, I'm not saying a word to anybody. And she said, don't tell anybody in the Free Methodist Church. And I said, no, that's not going to happen. No. Well, my mother's favorite verse in the Bible. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Now, my dad's journey, like I said, never resembled anything like my mother's. And, he always tithed. He believed in tithing. He made me tithe, and I got a quarter allowance, and I had to give a nickel of that up. And I was not happy. But you just did it. You had to do it. And he said one time, I said, don't you get tired of, not being able to go to church with Mom? And he said, well, let's just not talk about it. And I said, okay. All right. So after I left home, I got a call one day. It was right after I left home. I think I had something to do with it. I think he didn't go to church because of me. No, not really. But anyway, he called me up. He said, guess what? I said, what? He said, I'm going to church. I said, well, that's great. I said, what happened? He said, I was talking to God in the barn. I said, you were? He said, yeah. He said, I talked to him a lot. He said, you just don't know it. And I said, well, good. And I said, and what? He said, I told him that, I always felt like I was a hypocrite if I went to church. And he said, I thought, well, maybe I should go talk to Mother first about this. And he said, I went into Mom. And he said, Mother, I always wanted to go to church with you, but he said, I always felt like a hypocrite. Mom said, why would you feel like a hypocrite? And he said, because I like to dance. And he said, I like to have a beer. He said, I like to play cards. And Mom said, well? He said, the Free Methodists don't like that. And he said, they don't like a lot of things. That didn't stop me from going. She said, you have your own journey to go on. You have your own faith. Do you believe in God? Yes. Do you believe forgiven of sins? Yes. He said, he forgave me a long time ago. My dad said, and I said, well, that's good. I like to hear that. And he said, I always believed in God. I have faith in your mother. I have faith in the church. He was very faithful to the church. He always was giving. And it reminds me of the sermon where Ruth was talking about the paralytic, Matthew. And I kind of like the Mark version a little better because it describes 4 men carrying the mat, carrying the guy on the mat. And when Jesus saw them, he saw their faith. Their faith. It wasn't just the paralytics. It was the guys carrying the mat. And he forgave the guy of his sins, and he healed his body. And I always considered my dad carrying the mat. I can just see him because he helped everybody. People needed money, he gave them money. He needed advice, he gave them more than they needed. He always gave more than anything. But, he was always faithful. And my mother saw that in him. And when when he said the word hypocrite, she just couldn't believe that he would even think this. And she said, well, I'll tell you what. She said, I can go to any church, absolutely any church, and I can be alone with God. Because that's me and God having a conversation. You have your own personal relationship with God. I have mine. He said, but I can never be like you, Mother. I can't be like you. She said, have I ever asked you to be like me? And he said, no. She said, there you have it. So that was it. Then my mother died, and my dad lost it for a couple months. He really lost it. And so we got a place, we got an apartment, and my nephew, which was his grandson, we built an apartment onto his house, which is on the original farm that my father owned. And he started to come back. Of course, with the 4 great-grandchildren, he loved children. With the 4 great-grandchildren there, it gave him a purpose. It gave him a reason to go on. And I came down one day, and he said, don't come in the room. I said, why? He said, Mother's here. And he said, can you see her? I said, no, I can't see her. But I began to feel her, the presence. And over the course of the 4 years that he was with my nephew, she would appear to him. And he said how comforting it was for him. And she came to him like the week before he died, and I did experience that too, but I never saw her. But I know he did. And she was very faithful to him, clear to the very end. After he got very ill and he had to have skilled nursing, he had to go to a nursing home. And he had a septicemia 5 times. The last time it killed him. But the first time he was hospitalized, the doctor called me and said, your father's in a coma, and I don't think he's going to make it. So I drove down, and I went in, and he was in a coma, and he was laying there, and his big hands, and I laid my head down, and I was praying. all of a sudden, his hand moved. And I'm sitting there, and he said, well, what are you crying about? And I said, well, I thought you were dying. And he looked around and everything, and he said, well, I guess not. And I said, well, how you feeling? He said, great. I said, you do? And I said, do you know what day it is? He said, yeah, November 11th, Veterans Day. And I said, well, yeah, it is. And I said, how'd you know that? And he said, if you turn around, look at the board behind you. It's written on the board. I said, do you know what year it is? And he said, I haven't got a clue. I haven't got a clue. So every time, there was just, every time the doctor would call me when he had this septicemia, he would always come out of it. And so finally the doctor said, the next time I call, it's going to be the undertaker. The undertaker will call you. And sure enough, the undertaker called me. And I said, oh dear. And he said, well, bring his suit and a pair of underwear. I said, a pair of underwear for my father? He said, yes, you have to have a new pair. Oh, golly. So I called Carol and I said, I have to go do this and this and this and this. And so I stopped at the store and I said, I ran in and I got his favorite kind. And the guy said, you know what, if you buy a second pair, you get 50% off. And I said, well, no. I said, I only need to plant my father. He said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. And I said, well, I'm sorry too. But anyway, so we get down there and everything like that, and it was late when we got down there. And finally, about midnight, the nurses said, why don't you go over to your motel and just wait? She said, because we'll call you if it gets right down to the very last. I said, fine. So we went, and we were really tired. I woke up at 8 o'clock, sun was shining, and I said, oh, Carol, I said, they forgot to call us. Carol said, oh, let's get dressed. So we got dressed, and we ran over there. Walked in, he said, hey. I said, oh, I'm really angry with you. And he goes, what's the matter? And I said, well, you're supposed to be dying, number one, and I bought underwear for you. And I said, I could have got 2 on sale, and I'm telling him all this, and he said, well, and I said, and we brought our funeral clothes. And he goes, oh, Lord. And he said, well, I'm still here. And he said, I tell you what, girls, he said, go over to the motel, put on your funeral clothes, and come back. And I said, why? He said, I want to see what you look like when I'm in the casket. I said, you're sick. You really are sick. And he said, go on, girls, go on. So we went over and we put on our funeral clothes and we came back and he said, ha. He said, there's the Triplett girls. He said, they're beautiful. And I said, oh, that's great. That's great. He said, what songs are they going to be singing? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, probably the ones you like, the old Rugged Cross, you know, He Leadeth Me. That's funny. That was sung today. I said something else. He said, is there going to be any hillbilly songs? And Carol said, no. And he said, come on, Woods. He said, he called me Woods. And he gave me my nickname. My nickname was Woods. It started out to be Tootsie Woodsy because it was a song. You remember that song? Tootsie Woodsy, goodbye. And I was wee little, and I would sing that, and, he'd say, go for it, Woods. And I'd sing it, and so he called me his little Tootsie Woodsy. And then it got to be Woods, and he said, come on, Woods. He said, sing me one of those hillbilly songs. He said, sing it for your sister. She loves it. And I said, I really don't want to sing that song. And he said, oh, yeah. He said, sing it for me. He said, sing it before I die. He said, because I know they won't sing it in church. And I said, okay, I will. But anyway, one of the things that happened, and I'll quit, was this little story about 1 o'clock in the morning. This was a week before he died. And it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and Shelley, the nurse, called me, and she said, I got to tell you about your father. And I said, oh, God, what did he do now? And she said, no, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. And she said, he was raising Cain back in his room, and he wouldn't go to sleep. She said, so I went back. She said, the television was on. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. They had a country western dance program on television. And he said, hey, said Shelley, he said, do you know how to two-step? Do the Texas two-step? And Shelley said, no. He said, well, you unhook me from these IVs and get me up. And he said, I'll teach you. And Shelley said, I can't do that. He said, sure you can. He said, I promise I'll go right to bed. Promise. And so she said, okay. And so she unhooked him and got him up. And she said, well, I'm just here to tell you we went down Ward A, Ward B, and Ward C. And she said, boy, she said, can he dance? She said, he's so strong. And I said, I told you he could dance. And she said, oh, wow. And she said, you know what? I got back in, hooked up the IVs, and went right sound asleep. And, when she read Proverbs 22:6 at my request about training children in the right way, and when they get old, they will not stray, I'll always be grateful for that, because who knows where I would be. But boy, they would be proud of me. I'll tell you that today. Because she knew that I liked to sing, and if I hadn't come to this church, that wouldn't have happened. Anyway, thank you very much.